Lecture 34, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Well, welcome once again to our series of lectures on the literature of the Middle Ages. In this lecture, which we'll devote to Gawain and the Green Knight, we make two returns. First, we return to England, where we began with Beowulf. Second, we return to romance. Now, we've hardly left love behind us in our recent lectures, but we have not spoken since the Romance of the Rose about a romance per se. Now we return to one of the most wonderful romances of the Middle Ages. Now, in our attempt to come to grips with Gawain, to understand this text, there are, I think, two kinds of background that will be helpful to us in approaching the poem. First of all, a few technical details. The anonymous poem was composed in a somewhat archaic West Midlands dialect, perhaps around 1375. Now, the reason to mention that seemingly obscure fact is this. There's some wonderful poetry produced in this West Midlands dialect. We'll have more to say about that in just a second, but this is exactly the same time when Chaucer is writing. Chaucer wrote the English of London. It was Chaucer's kind of English that eventually became our kind of English. The kind of English that we find in Gawain and the Green Knight was, in a sense, a dead end, a road that did not go anywhere. The poem itself survives in a single manuscript that contains three other poems: Pearl, Cleanness, and Patience. It's usually assumed, on the basis of linguistic study, that all four poems are by the same author. We don't know that for sure, but this is the general assumption, and this author is usually called the Pearl poet. We don't actually know the author's name. The poem itself is 2,530 lines long. Now, we can compare that Beowulf at 3,182 or Roland at 4,002, so it's a bit shorter than some of the texts we discussed in our earlier lectures. Much shorter, however, than, for example, the Romance of the Rose. The poem is in alliterative verse. Remember, that's the verse form that we met in Beowulf. It is a form that has not been seen really very much since the eclipse of Old English literature. The vernaculars of 12th and 13th century Europe generally preferred elaborate rhyme schemes rather than schemes of alliteration. Let me give you just an example from the opening section of Gawain and in a modern English translation, but nevertheless this translation makes the alliterations very clear. The king lay at Camelot at Christmas time, with feasting and fellowship and carefree mirth. You can hear the you see? So you have these alliterations that run through the poem, two in one half line, one in another half line. Scholars have long spoken of an alliterative revival in the 14th century, and that's important. But it's important to bear in mind, too, that at the very same time we have a tremendous explosion of literature in the London dialects that we're going to have a brighter future in front of them. A second piece of background. This pertains to Arthurian material and to Gawain's place in it. Now, when we were talking about romance a few lectures back, we noticed that the romance will sometimes be set in the classical world, ostensibly in the classical world, and sometimes will deal with the matter of Britain, in other words, with the world of King Arthur. Now, even in early Celtic renditions, Gawain appears as Arthur's nephew. And he's always the king's great support, and he's always the king's great protector. In other words, Gawain is one of the traditional figures of the Arthurian cast of characters. From sculptures at Modena in Italy to scattered references in 12th century Latin writings, it's clear that Arthur and Gawain were widely known. Very, very interesting to notice that this was not a sort of a narrowly confined literary phenomenon. It was not something confined initially to sort of Celtic literature that then percolated over somehow into French literature. We can find example from, as I say, from sculpture to Latin texts, that the Arthurian materials, the matter of Britain, was growing in popularity. But it wasn't until Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote his History of the Kings of Britain between about 1139 and 1147, that anyone treated the matter of Britain seriously in a Latin work. Now, it must be said, there is a great deal of legend in Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, and many sort of Arthurian fans have turned to Geoffrey as if somehow he were just telling the truth and this was actually the world of Arthur, clean and unvarnished. Well, that's not true. But the point is that when Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote of the world of Arthur in Latin, he gave the materials a kind of authenticity and a kind of authority that they had not previously possessed. There was an outpouring of Gawain stories in French and in German romances, and in no fewer than a dozen different English versions. So Gawain's popularity was really unprecedented among the Arthurian knights. You might think, well, gee, wouldn't Lancelot have been the big guy here? No, it's Gawain. Gawain is the one who turns up again and again and again and again in literature. So it's not surprising that this wonderful 14th century romance would have been focused on Gawain rather than one of the other characters from the Arthurian cast. Telling, too, is the conventional portrait of Gawain. He's young, he's brave, he's loyal, he's courteous. Remember in Guillaume de Lorris, in the beginning of the Romance of the Rose, his wonderful description of the ideal courtly knight? Well, Gawain comes awfully close to that kind of a description. We can see again the conventions in full operation. And Gawain always seems to embody these qualities, these virtues, if you will, more so than any other knight of the Round Table. That having been said, we're going to see that whoever it was who wrote Gawain and the Green Knight, he felt free to tinker with those conventions. Now, Gawain and the Green Knight is both a straightforward adventure and mystery tale. It can be read on one level just as a great story, and it is a good story. But it is also a dense forest of symbols. We could go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the mysterious range of symbols that the author has inscribed into this text. Let's tell the story, first of all, moving rather straight through it, and then we'll come back and reflect on it from a number of different points of view. Arthur and his knights are gathered at Camelot. It is Christmas. The scene is one of great merriment. The scene is lush. The scene is joyous. Arthur, however, insists that he will not eat, that means no one else can eat either, until someone tells a tale of adventure. Almost on cue, no one tells a tale of adventure, an enormous and hideous green knight bursts through the doors of the hall. Students nowadays, of course, immediately think of the Incredible Hulk, and there's probably, a decent parallel there. Well, Arthur courteously invites the stranger to join the celebration, just what you would expect Arthur, the perfect host, to do. But the knight declines. He says he has come because he has heard of the court, and he wishes to challenge the men to a Christmas game. We could just pause here and say, doesn't this remind us a bit of Beowulf? Everyone is inside Harrod, drinking and eating and making merry, and there is danger lurking outside. You see, so is this a literary allusion or a common kind of trope that in here all is warm and bright and beautiful, and out there everything is awful? Well, we'll have more to say about themes and issues and so on, but that's a good example of one of the kinds of things that we find straight away in Gawain. The game, which the Green Knight proposes, is this: trading one blow for one blow. One is to be delivered now, one is to be delivered a year hence. And the Green Knight offers his own battle axe to whomever wishes to accept the challenge. Well, Gawain leaps from his seat and insists that he be the one who is allowed to accept the challenge. The Green Knight courteously offers his neck. Gawain strikes a mighty blow, severs the Green Knight's head, and then to everyone's astonishment, the knight reaches down, picks up his head, puts it on, gets on his horse, and rides away, reminding Gawain that he must appear a year later at the Green Chapel on New Year's Day, and off he goes. Well, to the astonishment of the people at court abates a little, the feast goes on, and then the story fast forwards to All Saints' Day of the next year, November 1st. On this day, Gawain must make his preparations to leave. Now, we aren't told really very much about his journey. He traverses a cold and mysterious landscape. Well, it's November. We're in the northern world. But we're not really told very much about this landscape. And then he comes upon a grand castle, which is described in very great, almost loving detail. Now, here are some of the more knightly, we might almost say, as opposed to courtly features. Courtly considerations wouldn't necessarily have demanded this elaborate description of the castle before which Gawain has found himself. Well, it's coming to be Christmas time. Now, you notice he's left on the 1st of November. Now it's about Christmas time. We don't have these several weeks filled in for us. Okay? Gawain has been traveling. Well, he's hospitably invited to come into this great castle, and he is warmly encouraged to join the celebration. He's treated to every possible consideration. The lord of the castle proposes that someone devise a Christmas game. You know, we might almost, as an aside, think Gawain should have at this point begun to smell a rat. But anyway, the knight of the castle proposes a Christmas game. Well, Gawain said, gee, he would really love to join in the merriment and join in the games, but he is honor-bound to go to the Green Chapel by New Year's. And then the lord of the castle says, well, that's not going to be a problem at all. The Green Chapel is actually very nearby. And he says, for the next 3 days, we'll have a game. And here's the game. The lord of the castle says, I'm going hunting. You, Gawain, you stay here in the castle. And at the end of each day, we'll exchange what we've caught. Well, the lord of the castle goes hunting, of course, and catches various prey. Gawain, meanwhile, is in the castle, where he is submitted to the amorous advances of the lady of the castle. Now, Gawain, well, courteously, foolishly, we aren't really told, he refuses to bed the lady, but each day they exchange a kiss. So, rather comically, at the end of each day, the lord of the castle comes back and hands over to Gawain his prey from that day's hunt, and Gawain kisses the lord of the castle. We do have to wonder what the lord of the castle thought this was all about. You know, was he oblivious to what was going on? Well, no, we're going to learn he, in fact, was not oblivious. On the third day, the lady of the castle gives Gawain a green sash that will allegedly protect him from any evil or misfortune. Perhaps she senses some foreboding, some gloom. Well, Gawain then takes his knight, he gets directions onto the Green Chapel, he takes his leave, and he goes on to acquit himself there of his debt. On arriving, Gawain is welcomed by the Green Knight, who first of all praises him for coming as agreed. Gawain now prepares himself to receive his blow. The Green Knight goes to swing his axe. Gawain flinches. Gawain prepares himself again. The Green Knight prepares to swing his axe. Gawain flinches again. Now, the Green Knight chides him a bit and says, to stand up and take this like a man. And Gawain says, all right, get on with it. And now he sets himself, and the Green Knight prepares to swing for the third time. The Green Knight deliberately gives a glancing blow. He just sort of grazes Gawain, and then reveals to Gawain that all of this has been an elaborate game of his own devising, that he knows about the kisses, he knows about the green sash. And then he reveals himself to be Bersilac de Hautezere, the lord of the castle. Gawain, for his part, confesses his error, confesses his deception, regrets his lack of courage. But the Green Knight, now Bersilac, tells him that he, Gawain, has not dropped at all in anyone's esteem. Gawain now returns to Camelot. He tells his tale to the assembled knights of the Round Table, and all the knights, at Arthur's prompting, don green sashes in solidarity with Gawain. That's the story. Well, as I said, it's a wonderful story. It's an adventure story. It's quite an interesting story, quite a powerful story in lots of ways. It's the sort of thing that can be read by readers of almost any age. But if we try to begin working our way beneath the surface of this story, if we try to interpret Gawain, if we try to say, what in the world is going on here? What does this story mean? Well, we find that we can just go more and more and more deeply. This is a bit like peeling an onion or like peeling an artichoke. On a fairly simple level, the poet plays with knightly and chivalric conventions. For instance, right at the very beginning, Gawain jumps at the chance to show off before the court by striking the first blow. Okay. Now, does this make him the bravest and the greatest of the warriors there? Does this, remember when we talked about Roland, does this make him rash, not prudent? Is this a sign of his démesure and not of his mesure? Is there something ever so slightly cowardly about this? Or, if not cowardly, cunning, deceptive, deceitful? In other words, Gawain reckons, hey, look, if I get to strike the first blow, I kill this guy. I don't have to go up and show up yet next year and get my blow. There'll be nobody to give me that blow. You see? Well, it's certainly clear that the Gawain poet is inviting us to think right away about this man Gawain and about how we first encounter him. Well, as we know, the Green Knight's head fell to the floor, but he picked it up and put it back on. So Gawain does indeed honor his covenant. The word covenant is used a number of times. I'm going to come back to why that may be significant. But he honors his covenant to go and receive his blow. Okay, so there we meet a Gawain who certainly is marked by mesure, who is marked by prudence, you see, who is marked by honor. All right. Now Gawain goes to the Green Chapel, while Gawain is at the castle. Each of 3 days, he hands over, so to speak, his kiss, but he doesn't hand over his green sash. Has he been entirely honest? Has he played the second game fairly? Or has he been prudent? Has he been clever? Do we have here the ethical world of the Romance of the Rose? You know what you want to get, make a plan to get it. If you have to lie, cheat, and steal, well, the point is to prevail. Or do we have here the kind of ethical world that places sort of absolute values above everything else? Well, it's rather interesting, isn't it? What would one say? I mean, should Gawain take whatever steps he could to save himself? Or should he have handed over the green sash? Gawain is doubtless brave. I mean, we see that in the fact that he goes back to meet up with the Green Knight. But he flinches twice. Now, does this make him human? I mean, who wouldn't flinch? You see? Or does it make him, in the eyes of the poet, or in the eyes of those who encountered this work, less than brave? Very interesting. Gawain does not consummate his relationship with Bersalac's wife. Well, we have seen that in the literature of romance, on some occasions, the wife, the lady is pursued, she is wooed, she is served, and there's no expectation that a physical relationship will ensue. On other occasions, we have seen in the conventions of romance that it's all about satisfaction. Which way is the Gawain poet taking us here, for instance? The portrayal of Arthur in this story is rather interesting. He's portrayed as young and frivolous. This is not the wise, old, sage, wonderful, just Arthur. He really is portrayed as rather young and frivolous. I mean, his insistence on somebody telling a wonderful story at the Christmas banquet is what's got this whole mess going in the first place. The very final scene, arraying the knights of the Round Table in green sashes, turning a symbol of deception into a badge of honor. How are we to take that? Now, do we have there, possibly, the kind of thing that again we noticed in Roland? The debate before Charlemagne about whether to accept terms proposed by Marsilie, or terms that might be proposed by Charlemagne, but to bring the war to an end. Some saying yea, some saying nay. The debate at Charlemagne's court at Aachen about Ganelon and Ganelon's fate. Should all be left to rest? Should bygones be bygones? Or should Ganelon be punished with the possibility of recriminations in the next generation. So do we have here, you see, at Arthur's court, this same kind of thing that, well, Gawain was a very clever boy, remarkable how he got out of that. Let's all have a sign of that cleverness. But that sign was a sign of deception. Is deception part of the knightly code? That's not normally thought to be the case. On another level, the poem's immensely rich descriptions are laden with symbolic meanings. Now, we could go on and on and on with this. Let's just use a few examples. Some of the depictions, for instance, of courtly life, of banquets, and so on, are conventional. And they really do no more than show an awareness on the part of this poet of what might be called the tricks of the trade. In other words, he knows how to write a good romance. He knows what's got to go in there. Okay. But in other cases, he's clearly doing much more than merely paying court to the tradition within which he's writing. The remarkably detailed accounts of the clothing and the armor of the Green Knight and of Gawain himself may, for instance, owe something to classical models. The arming of Achilles, the remarkable scene of the arming of Achilles in the Iliad, for instance, and comparable scenes in Virgil's Aeneid spring immediately to mind as classical references for this kind of elaborate description of the soldier and his accoutrements. Now, we see some of this sort of thing in Beowulf, we see some of this sort of thing in Roland. It's not at all uncommon. So we can say, yes, there are classical antecedents here. But it's also true that some of the symbolism and imagery that we meet in Gawain has taken on a register of meanings that are more specifically medieval, that are more characteristic of the Middle Ages. For instance, green and gold. We could go through a lot of color symbolism. Green and gold. They may suggest vegetation, life, renewal, green. They may suggest the sun, light, warmth, gold. So it may be, you see, that even in the colors that we are given, see, we are being told coded things about what we're supposed to think, how we're supposed to react. In the description of Gawain and his clothing and his weapons, we are presented with a considerably detailed description of the five-pointed star that is on his shield, the pentangle. Now, what kinds of evocations would that five-pointed star have had for readers or hearers of this poem? Well, the five senses, the five fingers of the warrior's hand, the five wounds of Christ, in each foot, in each hand, in his side, the five joys of Mary, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Resurrection, the Ascension, the Assumption, the five knightly virtues, generosity, brotherly love, purity of mind, courtesy, compassion. So one can go on and on and on. Now, is what is significant there the five? Well, there is certainly a lot made of the symbolism of five. Let's take one other example, the number 3. And number symbolism is all over the place in this poem. But the number 3. There are 3 days. There are 3 hunts. There are 3 kisses. There are 3 blows in the Green Chapel. 3, 3, 3, 3. All through the poem. Quite remarkable, that. There are deep religious themes in this poem. I mentioned earlier that Gawain and Bersilac, of course at that time merely the Green Knight, constantly refer to their covenant. So we have a sense from the time when, on the 1st of November, Gawain sets out on his journey to the Green Chapel, that he is rather mindlessly keeping his bargain. Now, there's all this other stuff about deception floating around, as I've mentioned a moment ago. But the fact is that we do have this sense, at least, that Gawain has just rather mindlessly gone on to fulfill his bargain. The scene in the Green Chapel. Now, why a chapel? Stop and think about that for a moment. It's very interesting. I mean, they could have met in a castle. They could have met out in the woods someplace. They meet in a chapel. It's immediately going to have religious significance. And the guy has gone to a chapel to get executed. That's not usually what we do in church. I mean, there are interesting sorts of things going on there. But anyway, he goes to the chapel, and he confesses to Bersilac his lack of courage, and so on. But Bersilac, in effect, absolves him. like a priest. And then urges him to wear the green sash as a sign of penance. It is as if, in a sense, the poet has invited us to think about the difference between, in his view, the mechanically applied regime of automatic justice of the Old Testament and the New Testament regime of forgiveness and redemption and salvation. Now, as a last way of looking at the poem, and you must bear in mind that we could go on and on and on. As I said, it is like peeling an onion. We might consider the games and tests. Remember, the whole thing starts with a Christmas game. Gawain gets to the castle of Bersilac and another Christmas game is proposed. Are these meant to turn the whole story into play? Are we meant to take it seriously? Is the whole thing a game? Are we complicit in this game? Did the author take it seriously? If we're looking for point of view and perspective, do we imagine the characters in the story taking it seriously? Well, poor Gawain does seem, in the end, to have wound up having to take this awfully seriously. Is Bersilac / Green Knight a sort of an ironic figure who's actually having a bit of fun all the while? Now, games, of course, are normal human entertainment. It's worth pointing out that a number of manuscripts of, for instance, which contain, for instance, romances, will depict lovers playing games, board games sometimes, chess. So entertainments, games, perfectly normal part of ordinary experience. But games can also take an ominous turn. They can turn out quite differently from the way we had expected them to. And obviously that's very much the case in this story. It's also true, once again, going back to classical literature, that tests or games are actually devices to reveal character. Authors use games, use the way people play games to reveal character. We hear faint echoes of that even in modern times. It matters not win or lose, it's how you play the game. Well, they keep score, don't they? But anyway, that's another story. Did Gawain pass his test? Did Gawain pass his test? Did Gawain win the game? Or did the game reveal the flaws in his character? Was he somehow a seriously flawed character? Or, if we sort of pan back from the scene slightly, is it the case that what the Gawain poet is doing is showing us some of the literary flexibility available to the author of romance, some of the flaws and contradictions in the code, in the courtly code, in the chivalric code? Is he showing us how it is possible to manipulate the Arthurian material? Well, it's impossible to say. It's difficult to believe that these questions would come up if the author hadn't planted them there to grow. But they did. Now, or he did. We might conclude by saying this. When we talked about the Italian triumvirate, Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio, we saw ourselves beginning to make a step-by-step move from the medieval world to the Renaissance world. Now let's bear in mind that if Gawain is written in the 1370s, it's written at just about the moment when Petrarch and Boccaccio are dying. Their careers have been expended. Here, far to the north, in England, we are still very much in the Middle Ages. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Gawain poet's greater contemporary, Geoffrey Chaucer, is also an author who will invite us to ask whether he stands with a foot in each of two worlds. And also, we may say that Italy and England were very different places, which I hope echoes a remark I made in my very first lecture, when I said that talking about hundreds of years and so much space is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to generalize. It's very difficult to say that there was a single thing called a medieval ethos or medieval literature or medieval culture. There were many. Middle Ages is plural. All of the ways we talk about the Middle Ages should be plural as well. And no one, perhaps, was more plural than Chaucer, to whom we shall turn next time.